The night the wounded Comanche staggered out of the cottonwoods. The prairie was holding its breath. Wind lay flat against the grass. Stars burned cold and sharp. And Mercy Caldwell was alone in her house with only a lantern and the steady ache of grief that had lived in her bones since her husband died. She had finished bolting the shutters when she heard it, a sound so faint it could have been the wind, worrying the eaves, or a coyote choking on its own hunger. Then it came again, closer this time, a dragged step, a breath pulled through pain. Mercy froze. She knew those sounds. The territory had taught her fast what they meant. Men hurt badly enough to make no noise were the most dangerous kind, and the ones who could not help making noise were already halfway to death. She lifted the lantern and stepped onto the porch, heart hammering, rifle leaning just inside the door where she could reach it in a blink. The light cut a trembling path through the dark, catching on dust, on the pale gleam of a fence rail, on the white blur of the well bucket. Then the beam found him. He was leaning against the split rail fence like a man who had been nailed there and forgotten, tall, even bent double, his hair hanging loose and black, his skin dark with blood that shone wet under the lantern's glow. An arrow shaft jutted from his side, broken short, the wound already clotted but still weeping. His eyes lifted when the light touched him, black, steady, burning with a pride so fierce it startled her even now when he was barely standing. Comanche her mind supplied at once. With the same certainty, it named dawn and winter and death. The stories came rushing in behind the word: raids and scalps, stolen horses, cabins burned, women taken screaming into the night. Her hand tightened on the lantern handle until her knuckles whitened. He swayed, caught himself, and she saw his breath hitch. Whatever he had been, whatever he might be again if he lived, in this moment he was a man bleeding out in her yard. The night held still, waiting to see what kind of woman Mercy Caldwell was. She should have raised the rifle. She should have shouted, fired a warning shot, sent him staggering back into the dark. She should have done what the men in town would have done without a thought. Instead, she took one step closer. The lantern light climbed his chest, showed the smear of blood, the torn buckskin, the deep cut across his shoulder that had been crudely bound. He had been hunted, she realized. Not a clean fight, not a fair one. A posse's work, most likely. She had seen the men ride out that morning, hard faces set. Talk of a Comanche who had taken a horse and a life down by the river. Men like that did not care much for proof. They cared for speed, for vengeance, for the feeling of righteousness that came with a rope and a crowd. "You can't stay there," she heard herself say, the words thin but steady. He did not answer. His gaze flicked to the door behind her, then back to her face, measuring, weighing. Mercy felt the old fear rise, sharp and bitter. But beneath it was something else, a stubborn refusal to let another human being die on her land if she could stop it. She set the lantern down and reached for him. When her hand brushed his arm, he flinched, a low sound tearing free of his chest before he could stop it. She saw his teeth flash, not in threat but in pain. "Easy," she murmured, though she did not know if he understood her words. She slid her shoulder under his arm, surprised by the weight of him, by the heat of his body. He was solid as a post, all muscle and bone, and for a breath she thought she had made a terrible mistake. Then he let himself lean on her just a fraction, just enough to keep from falling, and in that small surrender something in her settled. They moved together toward the house, each step an argument against fear, against sense, against the rules of a world that said a woman alone should not do this. The door creaked open, the lantern light spilled inside, and Mercy Caldwell led a Comanche warrior across her threshold. The smell of blood filled the room, copper and iron and sweat, sharp enough to sting her eyes. Mercy shut the door and slid the bolt home with a decisive clack that sounded like a promise and a threat both. She guided him to the table, made him sit, and only then did she step back far enough to see the damage clearly. The arrow wound was ugly, the shaft snapped off close to the skin, the fletching gone. The cut across his shoulder was deeper than she had thought, the cloth dark and stiff with dried blood. He watched her the whole time, eyes following every movement. His face a mask carved of stone, She could feel his strength coiled tight, ready to spring if she reached for the rifle. If she tried to bind him, if she did anything that smelled like a trap. "I'm going to help you," she said, and hated the tremor she could not quite keep out of her voice. She gestured to the chair, then to herself, miming care, water, rest. He hesitated, then gave a single short nod. The motion cost him. Sweat broke on his brow, and he pressed a hand to his side, fingers slick with blood. Mercy fetched water, tore cloth into strips, set her teeth and went to work. She had learned enough, nursing her husband through his last winter, to know what to do and what not to do. Enough to understand that pulling the arrow now could kill him. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her hands steady, despite the fact that she was acutely aware of being alone in a room with a man everyone around her would call an enemy. When she finished binding him, she stepped back and met his gaze. "You can rest here," she said, "just for the night." She did not say what would happen come morning. She did not know it herself. Outside, the prairie breathed again, wind stirring the grass, carrying with it the distant echo of hooves and voices, men still riding, still hunting, still convinced the world was theirs to scour clean. He slept in fits, breath shallow, eyes snapping open at every sound. Mercy sat in the chair by the hearth, rifle across her knees, listening to the crackle of the fire and the slow pull of his breathing. More than once she thought of the posse, of their hard smiles and ready ropes, of the way they would look at her if they knew what she had done. She thought of the land she had carved out with her own hands, of the nights she had stood alone against storms and sickness and loneliness, and told herself she would not be driven from it. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, it found her still awake, eyes gritty, resolve set. The Comanche stirred, pushed himself upright with a hiss of pain, and looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. He touched his chest, then his brow, a gesture she did not understand but felt the weight of. She nodded back, unsure, unwilling to pretend courage she did not feel. Outside, a bird called, then another. The world was waking up. Mercy rose to check the bindings, to put on the kettle, to do what women did when they decided to see a terrible thing through. She did not see the dust on the horizon yet. She did not hear the thunder of many hooves. But somewhere far beyond her fence line, word was traveling, carried by men with guns and by warriors with memories longer than any white man's map. The night she had crossed a line could not be taken back, and the day that followed would come for her, whether she was ready or not. By mid-morning, the light had turned hard and white, flattening the prairie until there was nowhere to hide, and Mercy felt the pressure of it, like a hand between her shoulder blades. She moved about the house with deliberate calm, though every sense was stretched tight, listening for hooves, for voices, for the sound of her own mistake catching up with her. The Comanche, she did not know his name, only the shape of his presence, sat where she had left him, back against the wall near the hearth, eyes half-lidded but sharp. Pain had not dulled him, it had only made him still. When she brought him water, he drank sparingly, as if accustomed to measuring out survival one swallow at a time. She pointed to the door, then to the window, then traced a slow circle in the air with her finger, trying to tell him what she herself was thinking. Men would come. He followed her gestures, gaze darkening, jaw setting. He touched the arrow wound, then made a slicing motion across his throat, a simple, brutal truth. If they found him, there would be no talking. Mercy felt a flare of anger then, hot and unexpected. "Not today," she said aloud. Not to him, but to the house, to the land, to whatever power had decided to test her in this way. She went to the root cellar and came back with a bundle of dried sage and a sack of cornmeal, provisions meant to last the winter. She set them on the table and met his eyes. "When you're strong enough," she said, tapping the door again, then pointing east, away from the town, away from the river where the posse had ridden. He studied her, the corners of his mouth twitching in something like wry acknowledgement. He shook his head once, slow and emphatic. He pointed to the ground, then to her chest, then spread his hands. Mercy did not need words to understand. Leaving now would leave a trail a child could follow. If he went, they would come here first. And if they did not find him, they would make her pay for his absence. The realization settled heavy in her gut. She had not just taken him in. She had tied their fates together. The first rider appeared near noon, a speck on the horizon that grew teeth and eyes, and a rifle as it drew closer. Mercy saw him from the window and felt her stomach drop, but she did not run. She closed the shutters on the back rooms, ushered the Comanche into the small pantry, and pulled the shelves back just far enough to hide him in the narrow space behind. Their eyes met one last time before she slid the boards into place. He touched her wrist, a brief, firm pressure, and she felt the callus of his palm, the strength he was holding in check. Then he was gone, swallowed by shadow and dust. Mercy smoothed her hair, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped onto the porch as if this were any other day. The rider reined in, a man she recognized from town. His face creased into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Morning, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, eyes flicking past her into the dim of the house. "You seen anything strange today?" Mercy met his gaze and did not look away. "Only you," she replied evenly. He laughed, but there was an edge to it. He told her they were tracking a Comanche who had killed a man, that it would go easier for everyone if she told them what she knew. Mercy thought of her husband, of the way the town had turned its back on her when sickness made him useless, of the way men like this one spoke of justice as if it were a club meant only for others. "I know nothing," she said, and the truth of it was a thin thing stretched to breaking. He studied her a moment longer, then nodded, the smile gone. "We'll be back," he said as if it were a promise. He wheeled his horse and rode off, dust boiling up behind him. Mercy stood on the porch until he was gone from sight. Then she went inside and slid down the door, breath shuddering out of her. The hours crawled. Twice more riders came, and twice Mercy met them with the same calm refusal, the same carefully empty hands. Each time, the Comanche waited in the dark, silent as a held breath. When the sun dipped low and the light turned gold, Mercy finally let herself sit. She brought him food, and this time he ate more, strength creeping back into his hands, color returning to his face. He spoke then, a few low words in a language that rolled like water over stone. Mercy did not understand them, but she understood the tone. Gratitude, yes, and something else. Warning. He pointed to the horizon, then lifted both hands, fingers spread wide. A sign she had seen once before from afar, many. He drew a circle around the house with his finger, then placed his palm flat against the floor. "Stay," Mercy's heart hammered. "Your people?" she asked softly. He inclined his head. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the prairie went quiet in the way it did before a storm. Mercy looked at the man she had saved, at the house she had built, at the land that had never belonged to anyone in the way men claimed. She felt fear, sharp and bright, but beneath it was a steady resolve that surprised her with its strength. Whatever came with the dawn would come because she had chosen to see a wounded man as a man, not a monster. She reached for the rifle and set it by the door, not in threat but in readiness. The night closed in, thick with promise and far away, unseen but not unfelt. Hooves began to move in a different rhythm than the posse's, older, quieter, and bound by something stronger than vengeance. The night settled heavy and close, the kind that pressed sound flat against the earth, and Mercy felt every creak of the house as if it were a knock. She kept the lamp low, the flame barely breathing, and sat at the table with the rifle across her lap, listening to the wounded man's slow, controlled breaths from the pantry. Outside, the prairie was a black sea, stars drowned by cloud, wind gone slack. It was the silence that frightened her most. She had lived long enough on the edge of things to know that true quiet rarely meant peace. It meant waiting. Somewhere out there, men were circling back, and somewhere else, farther, but not as far as she would have liked. Others were riding with a purpose she could not yet name. She rose and moved through the house, checking shutters, touching walls, as if committing them to memory. When she returned to the pantry, she eased the shelves aside and crouched, meeting his eyes in the narrow dark. He was awake, alert despite the pain that still drew tight lines at the corners of his mouth. she whispered without words, a look that said soon, a look that asked, "Are you ready?" He nodded once. He touched the arrow wound, then the cut on his shoulder, then held up 2 fingers. 2 days, perhaps. 2 nights, or 2 choices. Mercy did not know which, only that time was a currency they did not have much of. The first sound came just after midnight, a low thunder that could have been distant storm or the shifting of the earth itself. Mercy stood, heart leaping, and pressed her ear to the door. There it was again, clearer now, a rhythm she knew too well. Hooves, many of them. She went cold, then hot, fear blooming like fire under her skin. She drew the Comanche out of hiding and guided him to the back room, to the window that faced the open land. "If it's them," she whispered, meaning the posse, "go." She mimed running, pointed east again. He watched her, eyes unreadable, then shook his head with the same firm refusal as before. He moved to the front window instead, peering through a crack in the shutter. The sound grew, not louder but closer, a tide pulling in. Then it changed. Mercy heard it too, the way the hooves struck the ground, the spacing, the absence of shouted orders and careless laughter. This was not the posse. This was something else entirely. The Comanche straightened, pain forgotten, and lifted his chin. Pride and relief flickered across his face, quick as lightning. He touched his chest, then raised 2 fingers again, then opened his hand. Palm out. "Family," Mercy swallowed. She moved to the door and set her hand on the bolt, the weight of what she was about to do settling on her shoulders. Outside, shadows detached themselves from the dark, tall and still, forming a ring around her small house. She could feel them there without seeing them, a presence like the edge of a blade. She took a breath, slid the bolt free, and opened the door. They were everywhere. Horses stood silent as statues, their riders astride them or on foot, faces painted, eyes reflecting the lantern light like stars caught in a well. Spears and rifles were held at ease, not raised, but Mercy felt their potential all the same. The circle was complete, unbroken, and in its center stood her, a woman in a plain dress with a rifle. She did not raise, and a heart that beat so loud she was sure they could hear it. For a long moment, no. One moved. Then one man dismounted and stepped forward. He was older, his hair streaked with gray, his posture straight despite it. He looked at Mercy, then past her into the house. He spoke, and though she did not understand the words, she felt the question in them like a weight. Mercy answered in the only way she could. She stepped aside and gestured inside, opening her home fully to them. A murmur ran through the circle, low and surprised. The wounded Comanche appeared in the doorway then, standing tall despite the pain, his presence a sudden heat. The older man's eyes widened and he stepped closer, hands reaching out to touch the younger man's face, his shoulders, as if to confirm he was real. Voices rose, overlapping, sharp with emotion. Mercy stood back, a witness to a reunion she had not known she was arranging. The older man turned to her. He studied her face, her hands, the rifle resting harmlessly against the doorframe. He spoke again, slower this time, and though she still did not understand the words, she understood the meaning when he reached out and placed his palm flat over his heart, then extended it toward her. Gratitude, honor, a debt acknowledged. Mercy felt tears sting her eyes, but she held herself still. The circle loosened, tension bleeding away, and the warriors began to move. Some tending to the wounded man, others watching the dark beyond the ring with wary eyes. Mercy realized then how close she had come to death, how thin the line had been between shelter and slaughter. The older man gestured, and 2 warriors stepped forward, setting something at her feet, a bundle of fine blankets, a small bag heavy with coins. Mercy shook her head, hands raised. "I didn't do it for that," she said, though she knew they could not understand her. The older man smiled, a small, knowing curve of his mouth. He spoke again, and the wounded man translated with gestures, halting but clear enough. "Safe," he indicated. "House safe, land safe." Mercy's breath caught. It was not a promise the white men of the territory could have made, and she knew it. Before dawn, they were gone. The circle melted back into the prairie, horses moving without sound, riders slipping into shadow. The older man paused at the edge of the light and looked back once more, his gaze steady and solemn. Mercy watched until the last shadow vanished, until the night gave up its grip and the first pale hint of morning touched the sky. She closed the door and leaned against it, legs shaking, a laugh and a sob tangled in her throat. She did not know what the next day would bring, whether the posse would return, whether the town would learn what she had done. But she knew this. When the warriors had surrounded her house, they had not come for blood. They had come for one of their own, and they had seen her. The prairie breathed again, and Mercy Caldwell stood in the quiet, changed forever by the choice she had made in the dark morning. Did not bring peace. It brought reckoning. The sun rose pale and sharp, casting long bars of light across the floor, and Mercy felt as though the house itself were holding its breath after the night's passing. She moved slowly, every muscle sore from tension she had not let herself feel until now. Outside, the grass lay flattened in a wide ring where the horses had stood, a silent testament that what she remembered had not been a dream. Tracks cut the earth clean and deliberate, not the wild churn of panic or violence, but the orderly marks of people who had come with purpose and left on their own terms. Mercy stood on the porch for a long time, studying those signs, committing them to memory. Anyone with eyes would see them too, and the men in town would not like what they implied: protection, alliance, a woman who had been seen. She was still there when the posse returned. This time they did not send one rider ahead. They came together, 6 men abreast, dust rising around them like smoke. Mercy felt the old fear stir, but it did not bloom into panic. Something had shifted in her during the night, a hardening, a clarity. She stepped down from the porch and waited in the open, hands visible, rifle resting against the wall behind her. The leader reined in, eyes flicking to the tracks, then to the house, then back to her face. His jaw tightened. "Busy night," he said. Mercy met his gaze. "Quiet," she replied. The men dismounted, spreading out, boots crunching in the dirt, hands close to their guns. One knelt to study the tracks, fingers tracing the deep prints. "Comanche," he said, certainty heavy in his voice. "A lot of them." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Where is he?" Mercy felt the question like a blade laid flat against her throat. "Gone," she said, and let that be the truth they could have. The leader laughed, a short, humorless bark. "You expect us to believe they came all this way and left empty-handed?" Mercy did not answer. She did not need to. The tracks spoke for her, and the men knew it. Anger flared, quick and dangerous. One of the men took a step toward her, hand half raised as if to grab her arm, and Mercy's pulse spiked. Before she could move, before words could spill and turn into something worse, a sound cut through the air, a low call, distant but unmistakable. Horses snorted. The men froze. Another call followed, closer now, and Mercy saw it land on them like a weight. The leader swore under his breath. He knew what it meant. They all did. Someone was watching, not from town, not from behind a badge or a rope, but from the open land that did not answer to their rules. The man dropped his hand. "You've made yourself a dangerous friend, Mrs. Caldwell," the leader said quietly. Mercy lifted her chin. "I made a choice," she replied. "Like you did." For a moment, she thought he might strike her anyway, might decide to teach her a lesson before pride could stop him. Then he turned away, spitting in the dirt. "We're done here," he said. "For now." They mounted up and rode off, glancing over their shoulders more than once, dust trailing behind them like a question they could not answer. The quiet that followed was deeper than before. Mercy went back inside and sat at the table, hands shaking now that the danger had passed. She poured herself water and drank it down, the simple act grounding her. She knew the town would talk. They would whisper that she had gone soft, that she had betrayed her own kind, that she had invited trouble down on herself and everyone else. She also knew that none of them had been there in the dark, faced with a bleeding man and a choice that would not wait. The thought steadied her. She rose and began to clean, scrubbing the floor, washing the cloth stiff with blood, setting the house back to rights as if order could be restored by will alone. As she worked, she felt eyes on her, not the hostile stare of men looking for weakness, but something else, an awareness that lingered like heat on skin. She glanced out the window and caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the land. A shadow slipping behind a stand of trees. Not a threat. A promise kept. By afternoon, a rider approached alone. Slow and deliberate, hands empty and visible. Mercy stepped onto the porch, heart steady but alert. He dismounted a respectful distance away and waited. He was younger than the elder she had seen the night before. His face open, his posture careful. He spoke, gesturing, then placed a small, carved token on the fence rail. Between them, a symbol she did not recognize but felt the weight of. He pointed to the horizon, then to her house, then made a crossing motion with his hands and shook his head. No harm. Mercy nodded, understanding more with instinct than language. The rider mounted again and rode off, leaving the token behind. Mercy picked it up, fingers closing around smooth wood worn by other hands. She looked out over the prairie, over the land that had tested her and marked her in return. The choice she had made was no longer hers alone. It had set something in motion, something that would not be undone. And as the sun dipped and the long shadows returned, Mercy Caldwell understood that survival on the frontier had never been about walls or guns alone. It had always been about knowing when to stand, when to bend, and when to open your door and let the world change. The weeks that followed did not settle into peace so much as into a tense understanding, like a ceasefire written on the wind. Mercy felt it in the way the land seemed to watch her now, in the way riders from town slowed when they passed her place, eyes flicking to the horizon before meeting hers. News traveled faster than horses ever could, and by the time the grass began to yellow under the sun, everyone knew the shape of her story, even if no one agreed on its telling. Some said she had hidden a murderer. Others said she had been bewitched or threatened. A few quieter voices admitted she had done what none of them had been brave enough to do. She had seen a man where others saw only an enemy. Mercy did not argue with any of it. She rose with the dawn, worked her land, and let the truth live in her hands rather than her mouth. The Comanche did not come often, and when they did, it was never with noise. A rider would appear at the edge of her land, wait until she saw him, then leave behind small signs. A strip of cured meat tied to the fence, a fresh hide laid carefully near the well, a bundle of herbs she recognized from her own mother's teachings. Once the wounded man himself came, walking this time his steps strong, his posture easy. He did not cross her threshold. He stood in the yard and lifted his hand in greeting. Pride and gratitude still etched into the lines of his face. Mercy stepped out to meet him, the space between them open and honest. He spoke a few words she could not understand, then touched his chest and inclined his head. Mercy answered in kind. They did not need more. What had passed between them was not something to be revisited lightly. It was enough to know he lived, and that her choice had not been wasted. The town tested her resolve in quieter ways. Supplies grew harder to come by. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Once, a shopkeeper hesitated before taking her money, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting trouble to walk in behind her. Mercy met these small cruelties with the same steadiness she had shown the night of the circle. She paid, she worked, she endured, and slowly, grudgingly, the edge dulled. When a child went missing near the river and was returned unharmed by dusk, fear shifted into something like respect. When a rancher's horses were stolen and reappeared the next morning, tethered and calm, men began to look at Mercy's place not as a danger, but as a boundary. Lines on a map mattered less than understandings made face to face, and Mercy had made hers in the most undeniable way possible. Late in the summer, a storm rolled in fast and hard, black clouds stacking high, thunder cracking so close it rattled the windows. Mercy was bringing in the last of the washing when she saw a rider fighting the wind, his horse stumbling in the mud. She ran without thinking, hauled him down, dragged him into the barn as the rain came down in sheets. He was white, younger than she expected, blood matting his hair from a fall. Mercy set to work as she had before, hands sure, mind clear. When he woke hours later, wrapped in clean cloth, he stared at her as if seeing a story made flesh. "They said you'd let me die," he whispered. Mercy tightened the bandage and met his eyes. "They were wrong," she said simply. The words surprised her with their ease. The world was not divided as cleanly as people wanted to believe, and she had learned that lesson in blood and fire. When winter crept back across the prairie, Mercy stood once more on her porch and watched the land go white. The carved token hung by the door now, a quiet sentinel. She thought of the night her house had been surrounded, of the fear that had nearly undone her, and of the strength that had risen in its place. She knew danger would never be far away. Not from men who feared what they could not control. Not from a frontier that demanded everything and gave back only what it chose. But she also knew she was not alone in the way she had once been. She had allies she might never sit down with. Promises spoken without words. A circle that had held when it mattered most. One evening, as the light faded and the first stars pricked the sky, Mercy heard hooves again. She felt the old thrill, the old tightening in her chest, but it passed quickly. A small group of riders stopped at the edge of her land, distant and respectful. One raised a hand. Mercy lifted hers in return. The exchange was brief, silent, complete. She went back inside, banked the fire, and sat at the table with a sense of quiet rightness. The choice she had made had not saved the world. It had not ended the violence or the hatred or the long, bloody history written into the soil beneath her feet. But it had saved one life, and in doing so, it had changed the shape of her own. On the frontier, survival was often measured in what you were willing to defend. Mercy had learned it could also be measured in what you were willing to protect. As the wind rose and the house creaked around her, she felt no regret, only a steady, hard-earned peace. When the warriors had surrounded her house, they had come prepared for war. They had left having found something rarer, and Mercy Caldwell, standing alone on her land beneath a vast and indifferent sky, knew that was a victory no posse could ever take from her.